I was trained as an experimental social psychologist. Also, very classic, traditional quantitative methods, but with an experimental design. Large-scale data. I had worked as a graduate student on a very large-scale survey of veterans and non-veterans of the Vietnam era, stratified by race and whether you were in combat or not, Vietnam or not, non-veteran. My first book was called Social Experiments with Len Sachs, and it was really an optimistic, now I would say kind of neoliberal reformist, but at that point it was like an optimistic way of saying, can we use science to improve society? And if we randomly assign community policing and traditional policing and look over time, can we see differences? If we randomly assign educational methods to different schools, controlling for demographics. So like Lois, I really appreciate that training. It's given me a kind of corduroy frame in my head about the kinds of considerations one must make if you're going to make empirical claims. Not to say that I buy the experimental stuff anymore, not to say that I want to participate in that, but I think it gives you a disciplined, in the best sense and the worst sense, way of viewing under what conditions can I make a claim that's not journalistic, that's not just political engagement, all of which I'm happy to engage in, but when can I make the claim that something is kind of systematic inquiry? And coming from an experimental frame, I then got a job at University of Pennsylvania, as you know, and Del Hymes was the dean. A preeminent ethnographer, and the building, Dell's vision was complex and profoundly interdisciplinary. So I was there at a time that Irving Goffman and Bambi Shefflin and Michael Katz and Linda Brodkey and Kit Willard and Marilyn Cochran Smith and Susan Lytle. It was an astonishing time of creating new language. It was a demooring in a different sense, I think. For me, I was like a working class kid who was suddenly in an elite university and didn't know which fork to use. On the other hand, it was a time of kind of exploding African American studies, feminist studies, beginnings of queer studies. And Dell was very committed to a kind of methodological pluralism at the Graduate Center. So many of us were hired because we did quantitative or experimental work, but many were hired because they did narrative or discourse or ethnography. Fred Erickson later came. So it was an astonishing place. Eli Anderson was there. I got to learn a lot from and with him. Lonnie Guinier was over at the law school. She and I got to write a book together, which was a quantitative analysis of race and gender at the law school. So here I am with all of these folks, and it was really like a kid in a ice cream store. I'm not a candy store kind of woman, but I am an ice cream store kind of woman. And I had done quantitative work on high school dropouts, which we called dropouts then, not pushouts. And the quantitative work that I had done convinced me that what we had in our textbooks, Pearl Rosenberg and I had done an analysis of how textbooks spoke about dropouts, and they were hopeless and helpless and depressed. And my quantitative work out of New York had demonstrated that actually they weren't helpless or hopeless or depressed. Some of the kids who stayed in school were, but the kids who had dropped out were like critical and engaged, and not to say dropping out was a good decision economically, but what motivated it was a critique and a yearning for something else. So I was interested in moving into a high school, spending a year, and actually interrogating, how does this practice, how do these outcomes get produced? What are the institutional, political, relational, and deeply racial and class dynamics that produce a graduation rate at a typical high school at that point of probably 20% of their incoming ninth graders? So I found a high school that had those characteristics, and I just planted myself, and I was learning on the job and then running back to Penn and talking to Linda and Dell and later Fred to understand For me, it was always both quantitative and qualitative. I think that's true for Lois as well. Ethnography was simply a frame to understand how does this institution understand its own practice and its own outcomes, and to what extent could I interrogate the space, but also ask probing enough questions that would crack the frame so people could talk about what held it together, what was so naturalized. And after that, I was hooked. I was really hooked on trying to understand not so much just outcomes, but the processes and the history and the historic political conditions that produce those outcomes. It was only later that I understood this was also a time of dramatic spiking of mass incarceration in the community. And so it was only later that I could layer on that some of what I was seeing was induced by the prison industrial complex. But at the time, I was kind of within education as a frame.